So let me introduce myself first of all. I'm Susanna Bleakley. I'm the Chief Executive of Morecambe Bay Partnership. One of the things that I would say for those of you who do not know about Morecambe Bay Partnership, we're a charity based in the north of England, and we concern ourselves with the large geographic area of the Bay. We've got a very broad portfolio of activity that encompasses art and archaeology, heritage and access, cycling and nature. And we're probably best known for the Cross Bay Walk, the Bay Cycleway, and also the beach cleans that we do. But our portfolio of activity is very broad. And one of the things that makes us rather different from other organisations and other charities is that we like to work in a very, very cross-sectoral way. We don't stick to one theme, we don't stick in silos. So we mix things up. So we're looking for benefits, community benefits, health and well-being benefits, benefits for conservation, benefits for nature, benefits for heritage. In summary, what we say that we do, our purpose is to celebrate and conserve Morecambe Bay and to connect local people and collaborate readily with others. So a very broad organisation. Like all charities, this year has been really, really tough. And gosh, we're so pleased and so proud for still being here, because a great many charities have really struggled over the last year with difficulties around funding and having to change what they do. We are immensely grateful for everybody that supports our work and immensely grateful for those of you who have made donations to our work. We had a campaign to raise money for our curlews and to help nesting curlews. And if you want to help us with our work to carry on with our curlew work, or also presenting talks and events like this, if you felt moved to make a donation, we'd hugely appreciate that. And you can donate to us by going to our website and looking for the donate link. But right now, I'm going to introduce Bill Shannon and hand over to Bill, who's going to be talking to us about the history of the Bay crossings. Bill has been a great friend to the partnership. Bill is a very popular speaker. He's a local historian of great renown, enormous wealth of knowledge about so many things to do with local history, but certainly got a passion for the Bay area. So I think it is up to me now to hand over to Bill. And I think, Bill, you'll be sharing your screen. So we're in your capable hands for the next 40 minutes or so.
I thank you, Susanna. Thank you very much indeed for those nice words. Right. Thank you for inviting me again. Could I just point out the little statement on the bottom of this about the use of copyright images, and I'd just ask you not to take any screen grabs from this presentation. As a number of people have already put in the chat, this painting is called Lancaster Sands. It dates from 1842 and it's by David Cox, and it's a wonderful evocation, I think, of crossing the sands. And I think the main thing I want to get across is that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the normal way of getting from Lancaster to Ulverston and beyond was across those sands, accompanied by a guide, as you can see in this painting. Now, in fact, this painting is almost at the end of the sand crossing era. But for the next 40 minutes or so, I want to talk about the routes, the different routes over the sands. I want to talk a bit about why people cross the sands and add a bit of history from the monks to the tourists. And finally, I want to add in, just at the end, throw in a little bit of speculation about the Romans. So just to locate us in space, for those not familiar, and I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar, but we're talking about the estuaries of the Kent and the Keer, the estuary of the Leven, and over here, the estuary of the Dodden. And the main routes went from near Bolton-le-Sands across to Kent's Bank, another one from in the vicinity of Floodborough-Holker across to Ulverston, and one going across to Millom. Now, it's worth pointing out that in the era that we're talking about, Barrow didn't exist, the Grange over Sands didn't exist, Dalton and Ulverston and indeed Cartmel were small market towns, but the regional centre was very much Lancaster. Now, with the coming of the Furness Railway, which opened in stages between 1846 and 1857, you could now cross the bay without getting your feet wet. And this is the Arnside Viaduct. It was built in 1857. It goes across the River Kent. But before then, why had people crossed the sands? Well, the answer, I think, can be readily seen from this turnpike road sign of 1836 in Cartmel. The distance to Lancaster is shown as 15 miles, and the distance to Ulverston is shown as 7 miles. Now, if you put Cartmel to Lancaster in the AA route planner, you'll see that the journey by road is 29.9 miles, which is roughly twice what it says on this milestone. And if you put in Cartmel to Ulverston, that comes out at 16 miles, again, more than twice the distance that it says on the milestone. So clearly that is the prime reason. It's a much quicker way of getting, but in reality, nobody would have gone through Cartmel from Lancaster to Ulverston, because in the period that we're talking about, there were no roads across the mosses here at the Lythe Valley and Meathop and the Witherslack mosses, Foulshaw, and so on and so forth. So the actual way from Lancaster involved going all the way up to Kendal and then across down to cross at the Leven at Newby Bridge. The bridge was built in 1651, and then on down to Ulverston. Now that was a total of 43 miles compared to 22 miles by the over sands route. So in those days, that would have taken at least an extra day to do that journey. So that's the reason why people cross the sands. Now, if we look at this is the earliest county map of Lancashire. This is Christopher Saxton's map of 1577. If you look closely, you'll see 3 places are distinguished by the words passage: the Hessbank Passage, Cart Lane Passage, and Conishead Passage. And these are the places where you could pick up a guide, where you could cross the main estuaries marked here as Leven Sands and Kent Sands. And by Saxton's time, the guides were appointed by and paid for by the Duchy of Lancaster, but earlier they'd been provided by the local monasteries. Now, why was a guide necessary? Well, the rivers Kent and Keer were and still are constantly changing their courses, and the same applies to the Leven seen here and to the Dodden. There were quicksands which could move on a daily basis, and after rains, the rivers might need crossing lower down. You needed a guide who was out on the sands every day and who knew the safe way to cross today, which might be quite different to the safe way across yesterday. Now, here's the setting out point for the bay crossing at Hessbank. This is the old inn here, and here's in the distance you can see the bay. In between is the railway line. And here's Carter Road, where it picks up on the other side of the bay. Carter here being the name usually given to the guides. And this crossing is shown here on this old sketch, the ancient coach road over the sands at Kent's Bank. You can see coming across from Hessbank, coming ashore here. Here, looking across the Leven estuary, that was your destination, which was Conishead Priory on the other side of the bay. But Saxton's map wasn't the first to suggest the existence of over sands crossing. This is a map dating from around about 1400. It's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's known as the Gough map. And as you can see, east is at the top, north is off to one side. Now, most rivers on this map are named in black ink along their length and have their letters FL for fluvius, which is the Latin word for river. These are different. They're highlighted, they're written in red, they're within a red frame, a cartouche, and they don't use the word river. They're being highlighted for a reason. The Lune, the Kent, the Leven, the Dudden, the Esk. I believe that reason was to draw attention to the over sands crossings of the northwest coast. Now, the Gough mapmaker has been criticised for missing out Morecambe Bay entirely. But is that our problem or his? We define a coast by the high water mark, marked here in yellow. But what if we defined that the coast by the point to which the lowest tides retreat? And I've marked that here in green. And I think that gives you something which is much nearer the sort of map that the Gough map maker was making back in 1400, indicating perhaps these intertidal zones shown in this paler green where the Oversands crossing could take place. However, neither Gough nor Saxton gives us any detail about where exactly you could cross the bay. And the first man to give us real detail on that was the Lancashire antiquary Richard Cuerden, who I wrote, I had published a book about, plug, but he mapped the roads of Lancashire in 1685. And here's an extract from some of his manuscript maps showing the way out of Lancaster. And as you come out of Lancaster, you cross the river, you pass a gibbet with a body hanging from it. This isn't, of course, the main execution place. That was down where the Ashton Memorial is. That was where the gallows were, but this is where the gibbet was. Anyway, you pass on past that and you head up north past a number of places where you could get onto the sands, to the sands. It shows turn off, although he doesn't actually name Hest Bank. And then across the other side of the bay, he picks up where the sands came ashore at Carter's, that name again, Carter's. And this is this, I've just coloured in that so we can do that onto the modern map. And you'll see here, it's now known as Guide's Farm, but this is Carter's Farm, Cart Lane, going up there. And then a couple of days later, Cuerden surveyed along what he described as a private way to White Creek and on to Kirkhead, which Susanna spoke about earlier, and then on up the coast to Kent's Bank. And I think, I'll come back to this later, but I think what we're looking at here is an alternative landing point. The main landing point is at Kent's Bank, but there seems to have been another one coming ashore at White Creek and heading up this private way. Now across, oops, sorry, and that's just putting that on the modern map, White Farm, Kirkhead, and up to Kent's Bank. If we look across the other side of the Cartmel Peninsula, Cuerden showed the road running through Flukeborough and ending at Sandgate Lane End. And this is Sandgate Lane End today, with the road coming off down onto the marshes and looking the other way as it heads out across the Leven estuary. But notice too on Cuerden's map, here's Flukeborough, here's the Waingate, marked as the Waingate to Lancaster. In other words, the wagon road that led to Lancaster. And this appears to be suggesting that there are these two ways. There's the main way, which comes through Kent's Bank, through Allithwaite, through Flukeborough, down to Sandgate. But if you notice, if you know the road, but if you don't and you look at the contours, you'll see that's actually quite a hilly way. So fine for foot and horseback, not so fine perhaps for a wagon. And so perhaps there was this other route which doesn't involve any hills apart from once there you go over 10 meters. Wow, you know, that's a hill in these parts. You come in from White Farm, go across Holme and to what's still marked Waingate, although this road is mainly known as Back Lane, and it's still accessible, but I found I couldn't get my car down it, so I didn't go down it very far. And the Cuerden also showed another route at what he called Gothershead Gate, very near a mile from Hooker Hall. This is just on the far side to the north of Hooker Hall. And this, which he's just sort of hinting at here, later becomes one of the main ways across the Leven. It's now known as Park Head, that area. And that, we can see these on the first printed map to show the Oversands route in any sort of detail. This is Thomas West's Antiquities of Furness, published in 1774, and it shows the way across the sands, So Hesbank, coming ashore at Carter's House, Halathwaite, Flukeborough, way across the sands to Ulverston. Now, you'll notice that it passes to the north of what's marked on this map as Halstead Chapel. Now, that island is known as Chapel Island now, but the earliest references actually calls it Halside rather than Halstead. And I spoke to Fiona Edmonds about this, and it seems to mean something like a rocky place, which is just about as accurate a description as you can have of that little island. So thanks to Fiona for that suggestion, and more about Chapel Island later. Now, in a slightly later publication, Thomas West's Guide to the Lakes, he shows, and this is a slightly weird orientation, as you can see, north is off up this way, but he shows two additional routes. There's the main one that we've been talking about, but he also shows two additional routes, one from Carterhouse up to Cartmel, and then down to what he calls Holker Gate here and across, and another going to Flukeborough, and then up through Cark to Hooker Hall and on that way. Now, and that seems to be the route that's being shown here in this engraving of 1842, which shows the Coniston Fells in the background coming ashore at what appears, as I say, to be Park Gate. Now, this is a photograph taken from that same position, taken at high tide, and shows the Coniston Fells, perhaps not quite as dramatic as in that engraving, but still a fairly reasonable depiction of them. Now, Hennett's map of 1839 shows yet another route. If we go in close, we've talked mainly about the one that came from Sandgate, and we've now been looking at the one that comes up from Parkhead up here. But now he shows this other route, which comes from up from Cark itself, where it says road across the sands at low water. You see running to the north of Chapel Island. And that seems to have become the favoured route for the mail coaches. And it involved crossing from, say, Cark, south of Holker Park, north of Chapel Island, and landing at Canal Foot and heading on up into Ulverston from there. And this anonymous painting in Lancaster Maritime Museum is marked as being from Lancaster Sands, but that seems to me to be Chapel Island. So this seems to be Leven Sands rather than Lancaster Sands, and they're heading across the Leven towards Ulverston, Chapel Island to the left. They're about to splash through the Leven itself, which can, as Susanna was telling me earlier, be sometimes up to waist deep on these walks. And certainly at this date, it was deep enough for a boat to be sailing on it. This bill from also in the Lancaster Maritime Museum shows the timetable for coaches during the month of September. Now, of course, the times that the coaches set out varies with the tides. It's dated 1848, but whatever time you set out from Lancaster to Ulverston or Ulverston to Lancaster, the journey over the Kent Sands, over the Leven, Hesbank to Ulverston took 9 hours. And incidentally, that route, the one from Cark to Canal Foot, is still shown on the Ordnance Survey map as being the route across the sands, although most journeys these days they either set out from Canal Foot and go to Chapel Island, or they set out from Sandgate there and go to Chapel Island. Now, when I was advertised this talk, a lady called Rose Clark contacted me and suggested that this building on its way into Cark may have played a servicing role for those coaches. If this image, I've taken this image from Google, as you can see, but the coach road ran up here towards the Engine Inn and turned left and headed off down to the bay. The key point is this place is now known as the Earbank Lodge. Formerly, it was the Railway Hotel, and it may, in an earlier life, have serviced the coaches. If you go around the back, and this is a photo Rose sent me, you can see the stables where people lodged their horses, now converted into little rooms, flats. But in front of the building, there is this rather interesting large stone with an embedded hook into it, which may have been a hitching point for travellers tying up their horses whilst pausing at the inn before setting off. Whether it was or not, I don't know. But having come up from that place, turned left past this building, which is Cark House, where the author of the Annals of Cartmel, Stockdale, lived in the late 19th century. It then crossed the river, came down this way, headed down to cross the railway. And it's interesting, of course, the railway is taking a similar route to what we're talking about. And then it headed off down towards the marshes and out across to Chapel Island and beyond. Good. So we've looked at where they crossed. Let's look at why. Why did people want to cross the sands? I think if you have a look at this painting again, it seems to be mainly people on their way to market. They've got full panniers, as you can see, or they've got backpacks, or they've got carts, or some of them are even driving animals. And that's partly because for the people of Furness and Cartmel, they've always looked south rather than north for business and official purposes, and also for work. I mean, there's a rather sad account in 1857 of a group of 7 young farm labourers who set off in a cart to cross Kent Sand to attend a hiring fair at Lancaster. Now, unfortunately, they didn't make it. All 7 were drowned. But there must have been many more who also did that same journey looking for work. Now, one consequence of COVID is I haven't been to the National Archives or Lancashire Archives for well over a year. So I haven't been able to do any original documentary research for this talk. So what I did was look through my files of old cases old court cases in the court of the Duchy of Lancaster, looking for casual references to crossing the sands. Now, what I was looking for was not something that's about crossing the sands, but something that just refers to it in passing, to emphasize this thing that it was normal. Now, this case is rather interesting, it's rather unusual, it's a murder case. And the short version is that William Bardsey of Bardsey fell out with William Sands of Conishead over tithe payments, and Bardsey's 2 sons attacked and murdered Sands. Now, here's a map just showing you where we're talking about. There's Bardsey, there's Conishead, and I'm just also going to emphasize where Holker Hall is, and you'll see why in a moment or so. Now, this is the evidence given by a gentleman called Matthew Elletson. He's a tenant of Bardsey's, lives at Bardsey. And basically, he reports that after the murder, the boys fled. And the key bit for us is which way they went. And he says they did go over the sands to the house of Christopher Preston, gentleman in Cartmel. Now, the house of Christopher Preston was, of course, Holker Hall. After that, they seem to have stayed overnight. Then they headed on across the Kent Sands, and then they headed for Scotland. And ultimately, they did get away with murder. But the point I'm making, though, is that for this witness, there's nothing special about this journey. That's just the way you go from Bardsey to Holker. Probably the Bardsey family had gone over to Holker on many occasions, or the Prestons had come over to Bardsey purely for social get-together. So that's another reason to market, going for work, but going also for social occasions. Now, basically, as far back as Domesday, before Lancashire existed, both sides of the bay were always regarded as being in the same county. In this case, it's Yorkshire. Cumberland and Westmoreland at this date were not even seen as part of the Kingdom of England. But after Lancashire came into existence, it was inevitable that this area looked to Lancaster as its headquarters, rather than to Appleby, capital of Westmoreland, or Carlisle, capital of Cumberland. I mean, basically, you look to Lancaster for all administrative and legal matters. If you wanted justice, you went to the assizes at Lancaster. Now, meanwhile, the development of the monastic houses in Lancashire would also have generated traffic across the bay. For example, Furness Abbey moved here from Preston, from Talcott in Preston in 1127, and set up a grange at Beaumont, which is between Hestbank and Lancaster on the far side of the bay. And you could imagine quite a bit of traffic passing backwards and forwards between those two places. There were then the two Augustinian houses at Conishead and Cartmel, both founded in the second half of the 12th century. And both came to be particularly associated with the Oversands crossing, as they took on the provision of guides as an act of charity. And in the 14th century, the canons of Conishead established their chapel on Chapel Island, then known as Halside or Halstead, to provide a haven and a refuge for travellers, somewhere to get out of the way if things were going badly wrong. Although, if you go onto the island and you look at the ruin, in fact, the ruin, in inverted commas, was a folly built by Colonel Braddill of Conishead in 1822. But nevertheless, there definitely was a medieval chapel on this island. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why people were crossing the bay. And then there were those who were looking to take commercial advantage of those who were crossing the bay. And now, whether it was the canons of Cartmel or the lords of Allithwaite, there was an attempt to cash in on this growing commercial traffic over the sands and across the peninsula by establishing a market and a borough at Flukeborough. Now, whether this took place quite as early as the date that's carved onto the market cross is not clear, but certainly by 1412, there was a charter which allowed for a weekly market on Tuesdays, and it allowed for 3-day fairs at Midsummer and at Michaelmas. But the town never took off in the way that it had been hoped. And I think many of these houses along Main Street and Market Street may well have acted as effectively as a motorway service station, midway between Ulverston and Lancaster, providing for the needs of travellers passing through. But just note this steep hill that leads out of Flukeborough to the west. And it was probably that led to this road being abandoned around about 1810 in favour of the road through Cark. And this is what James Stockdale has to say. He talks about the hill to the west, and I'm sorry if you can't see the top of that, it being very steep, and the road through Cark had been widened, made convenient for carriages, and the road through the western or upper part of Flukeborough became wholly disused by coaches, which from that time, around 1810, passed along the more level road through Cark. So that's the, Flukeborough had never really taken off, but that was the sort of death of Flukeborough as the main, as I say, motorway service station en route across the bay. Now, most of the records of both Conishead and Cartmel are lost. So we don't know when they started this service of providing, so I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm just making one other point. It wasn't only monks and market traders and people looking for work and people going for pleasure who crossed the sands. This is one of the earliest accounts we've got of crossing the sands, and it comes from the records of the abbey at Lanercost, and it tells us of Robert the Bruce's invasion in 1322, where he came down the west coast and he plundered Copeland and so on beyond the sands of Dodden to Furness, where he burnt and plundered it. And then he carried on across the sands of Leven to Cartmel, which he burnt. And then he crossed the sands of Leven as far as the town of Lancaster, which they burnt. So, again, it's the casual point of that's just the journey. That's the way he took. The key point is that he's burning everywhere as he went. But the key point to take home is that was the normal way of coming into England from Scotland. Now, as I just started to say about the records of Conishead and Cartmel being lost, and we don't know when the monks first started providing the guides, but we do know about the end of this era from what's called the Valor Ecclesiasticus, which was the record made by Henry VIII's commissioners valuing church property at the time of the Reformation. This is an early 19th century transcript, and it relates, as you can see, to Cartmel. And it shows that one William Gate, bailiff and conductor of the people of the Lord King across the sands of the sea called Cartmel Sands, and he's paid £6 a year for acting as the guide. And this is the same sort of record, this time for Conishead. And here we have John Hartley, bailiff, conductor of the people of the Lord King across the sands called Kent Sands. And he's paid, 66 shillings and 8 for doing that job. Now, in fact, there's an error here. It says Kent Sands, but in fact, we know from a later application by John Hartley, he applied for his old job back under the Duchy of Lancaster, and he calls himself Carter or Guide of Leven Sands. So you've got then these two guys being paid by the monastery. The Duchy of Lancaster takes over responsibility for that and goes on paying the same chaps, and has done ever since down to the present day. Oh, not quite true, but more or less true. Now, the Duchy took this job very seriously, and in 1539, it had a look at what responsibility it had taken on. And it actually proposed supplementing the guide with a ferry boat. It says it's very necessary to have a ferry boat at Cartmel Sands, for the ford there is very ill and dangerous, and the boat will serve when the ford faileth. Now, it was a good idea. It was obviously never taken up. And as far as I know, nothing came of it. And there was no regular crossing by boat until a steamer service started operating between Fleetwood and Bardsey in the early 19th century. Now, at about the same time as this document was produced in 1539, the great antiquary John Leyland visited the area. And although he didn't cross the sands himself, he was clearly aware of the route. And he says, if I'd kept the by-shore way from Lancaster to Cumberland, I should have gone by Cartmel Sand, where a fresh water doth come at 7 miles, to Conishead Sand, where a river resorteth at 8 miles, to Dudden Sands, where a river resorteth at 4 miles. So again, he's telling his readers about the normal way up around the west coast. He carried on going straight north, but he went on also to copy out a written itinerary of the whole of the coastal route. And as you can see, he gives the mileage from Carlisle to Brough by Sands, from Brough to Workington, from Workington to St Bees, from St Bees to Furness by the sea coast, from Furness to Lancaster, and Lancaster to Preston. Now, he does rather exaggerate or understate the mileage from Furness to Lancaster. He's put it as 12 miles, whereas 19 miles would be a better guess there. Anyway, in 1695, we get the first sort of slightly more detailed account of the sands in the Gibson edition of Camden's Britannia. And that talks about the dangers of these sands, the dangers to travellers by reason of the uncertainty of the tides, by reason of the many quicksands, upon which account there is a guide on horseback appointed to each sand for the direction of such persons as shall have occasion to pass over. And each of the 3 sands has a yearly salary paid out of His Majesty's revenue, the 3 being, of course, the ones that we've talked about, Kent, Leven and Dodden. And a visit to Carmel Priory will show you why you needed those sands. It's not difficult to find tombstones like this one, showing a boy aged 24, drowned on Lancaster Sands, January 1782, or this memorial of a little boy of 9, lost in 1843 when his cart here became bogged down. So you can probably understand that nobody crossed the sands unless they had a very good reason to do so. But from the late 18th century, a new phenomenon arose, and that was the tourist who was going to do the trip for fun, for the joy of sightseeing, not for work. And Father West's account from his Guide to the Lakes is full of the purple prose now thought appropriate for this genre. he talks about the grand view of alpine scenery, which is that engraving I showed earlier. He talks about the mountains strongly illuminated by the sunbeams and patched with the shadows of intervening clouds that sail along their sides, or when they drag their watery skirts over the summits and, admitting the streaming beams, adorn their rocky heads with silver and variegate their olive-coloured sides with stripes of gold and green. Who could possibly resist such a trip? And unsurprisingly, Wordsworth also got into the act, writing about Chapel Island in his prelude of 1805. And Rocky Island near a fragment stood itself like a sea rock, the low remains with shells encrusted dark and with briny weeds of a dilapidated structure, once a Romish chapel where the vested priests said matins at the hour that suited those who crossed the sands with ebb of morning tide. Now, of course, it wasn't always as idyllic as that. And I think this engraving by Turner of 1828 probably shows a more typical journey across the sands. And I think that tells you, I think, why from the 1860s, most tourists entered the lakes by train, apart from those who were coming in from Fleetwood to Bardsey by steamer, and very few were taking the Over Sands route. And nevertheless, some writers like Edwin Waugh continued to enthuse about the crossing. Edwin Waugh is a Lancashire poet and writer, and he produced this little book, and he's got engravings showing the Over Sands crossings, but he also has engravings of the views. And this one, as you can see, shows that new viaduct at Arnside that we opened with, whereas his take on Waugh's magnificent alpine scenery, the view across to Connis Head, is taken from the Leven Viaduct, not down here in the bay, Park Head or whatever, where the other one was engraving from, but actually from the railway train. And I think fewer and fewer people crossed the bay until in 1937, this writer of the Companion into Lakeland writes, scarcely 100 people a year take the route, but they are of the goodly company who are willing to try anything once, and they return to repeat one of the most delightful experiences even the Lake District with all its lonely dales and unspoilt beauty can offer. Now, all of this was to change later in the century, and it's particularly thanks, I think, to Cedric Robinson, now retired, who was appointed Queen's Guide in 1963. And by the time I did the walk for the first time in 1968, 1998, my wife has just corrected me. Yes, apologies. When I did the walk for the first time in 1998, there was something like 500 people on this trip alone. Now, the trip was organized by the Blind Welfare Society, and they made a 20-minute video of that day. And I'm going to play you a 1-minute extract of that, because I think this is now a historical record in its own right.
So, in order that the Society didn't lose any of its 500 plus walkers, they enlisted the help of the Queen's Guide for the Bay, Cedric Robinson. Cedric has guided thousands of parties across the Bay for many years, raising hundreds of thousands of pounds for charities. His knowledge of the tides and currents is invaluable in achieving a safe crossing. The day prior to each walk, Cedric and his nephew Ken travel across the bay to find a safe route. Every day, the sand and riverbeds can move due to wind, rain and tide, making it necessary to check every inch of the route. As the number of people in the parties can range from single figures to almost 1,000, the final route may change as the width of a safe path can be critical. Laurel branches are used to mark the route, and old branches can be seen as a reminder of where the route was for a previous crossing. Because conditions can change so rapidly, even from day to day, they cannot be used and new ones have to be planted.
So I just want to say a little bit more about these laurel branches known as brobs, which guides have been using from time immemorial to mark out the safe route. And I think you can see them quite clearly here on that engraving of Turner's, stretching out, marking that safe route. Point being, the river channels were constantly changing. The guide marked the way, And if you deviated from that route, you could readily find yourself ankle deep in foul-smelling mud, or much worse, thigh deep in the quicksands. And there's a wonderful account by an elderly lady talking about a trip she made in 1838 and giving a vivid description of this strange, wild-looking figure with masses of long, unkempt hair, as rough as a sheepskin thrown across the old white horse. He rode immediately in front of the coach horses, tested all the uncertain place first, warning back the driver if he found any of the quicksands had shifted or become unsafe, since he marked out the course in the early morning with little branches or bushes, which he called brobs. After seeing us over the dangerous parts, this queer, uncouth figure suddenly appeared at the carriage window, thrust in an old cap, also made of sheepskin, and asked for a recognition of his services. Now, these guides, such as Cedric, had learnt their trade as shrimp and cockle fishermen, going out daily onto the sands with horse and cart. The Wright's Dialect Dictionary gives an alternative of brog to brob. The word is only found in Cumberland and Lancashire, and its etymology seems to be related to poking or piercing or prodding. And in other words, a brob is simply something that you poke into the sand. Now, before I end, I just want to go back 2,000 years and think about whether the Romans used these routes. In an earlier talk in the Sunset series, I spoke about the 2nd century Greek geographer Ptolemy and his references to these tidal flats. And I spoke about Agricola's invasion of the north about 80 AD, which may have involved the Roman army crossing the bay. But did it become a Roman road thereafter? I mean, obviously they wouldn't have built an actual road across the bay, but did they build roads across the Cartmel and Furness peninsulas that point to them having used these routes? Now, Thompson Watkin, the first major historian of Roman Lancashire, certainly believed they did. He marks the roads across the two ways quite clearly. And in his text, he says, it's certain the Roman road is visible. He says it becomes visible near Wyke. He says it runs to Flukeburgh, where a portion of it still remains. He says a pavement of large stones was discovered on the other side near Conishead. It then passes by Street Gate. Of course, any use of an old street name with street in it is usually a dead giveaway for a Roman road. And then to Dalton, where it was found by some workmen digging in 1803. So Thompson Watkin, absolutely no doubt, there were Roman roads across the two peninsulas. Now, more recently, the local Roman coin specialist, David Shotter, who sadly died last month, he's drawn attention to the finds of Roman coin hoards at Holker, at Castlesteads, near Carnforth, near Barrow, all suggesting the probability of Roman activity around the bay. But recent archaeologists have not been able to find any traces of the road. I asked the great specialist in Roman roads of the north, David Ratledge, to look at a LiDAR image for me and see if he could find our road across Cartmel, but I'm afraid he couldn't. Now, I'd expect the road not to take the line of that road through Flukeburgh to Sandgate, but to have taken this back lane Waingate route. But strangely, there's absolutely no sign of, I mean, quite clearly, this line joins to that line, but absolutely no sign of this on the LiDAR image. So all we can say is the case for regular Roman use of the Oversands crossings remains unproven for now, but that's not going to stop me believing that they did. And I've no doubt too that long before the Romans, the local people crossed the sands from time to time as they needed to. So finally, I'd just like to thank my wife Mavis, who's sitting next to me and nudging me when I say something wrong. She's made numerous contributions to this talk, and she's seen here 10 years ago in 2010, crossing the Kent Sands with our then dog, my daughter and my granddaughter. We've done the walk 4 times now across Kent Sands and once across the Leven to Chapel Island. And I think if you get the chance, you should have a go too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was terrific. That was it's such a lovely and interesting recollection. I love the the thought of some unkempt guide. It sounded a little bit to me like he was creating a bit of drama and theatre about testing the sands, and I can't help feeling that Cedric was also one for creating a certain amount of drama and theatre about crossbow boards.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that element of theatre has passed down the generations too.
Yeah, it was actually really lovely to see that bit of film footage of Cedric with his nephew Kenny, who was an early friend of Morecambe Bay Partnership. Kenny, that is, and also a photographer. And we used some of his early photographs right in the early days of Morecambe Bay Partnership.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and I would encourage everybody to throw their questions into the chat. We've already had one or two, and we'll come to as many as we can. There is one just picking up a question immediately on what you said. A throwaway comment to you, Bill. It is obvious that Street is a Roman name.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
It is not obvious to us all. So give us a hand.
I do apologise, but generally speaking, places that are called things like Chester Street or that sort of name are generally speaking on Roman roads. The word strata has the meaning in and I mean, why am I saying this when Fiona's in the audience? But it generally has the meaning of a paved road very early on, and generally speaking, it's recognised as a very good pointer to the presence of a Roman road. So something that combines the, if you like, the Anglo-Saxon / Latin word street with the local Norse-derived gate is a lovely sort of combination of those two. It's the street gate.
Well, that was going to be then my next question, because one of the early maps that you showed us talked about passage.
Yes.
And would passage normally be used for a crossing of this nature? I mean, clearly it is in this part of the world.
The only place I've come across that is Saxton. But Saxton clearly picked it up as the local word. So, but I don't know if it's used in general. But I say Saxton. When he visited the area in 1577, his job was to interview people to find out the names and and all the rest of it. And clearly he wrote down that as a local name. Yeah.
And for those who have not heard Bill talk about the origins of the name Morecambe Bay, and I think probably only a handful of people on this talk this evening will have heard Bill do that talk. But anybody who has enjoyed this evening and has enjoyed hearing Bill talk may wish to look on our YouTube channel, where they'll be able to find Bill giving a talk about the origins of the name Morecambe Bay, which is a very recent name, because Bill, in your early maps and your early recollections, you were talking about the sands. So could you just help people understand the significance of talking about the sands and not the bay?
Yes. Well, yes. Without spending the next 45 minutes doing the full talk. Those areas are historically, you saw that on the Saxton map and so on. They're always referred to as Kent Sands, Leven Sands, Cartmel Sands, Lancaster Sands, etc. There was not a generic name for the bay as we now think of it. And it's not until the late 18th century antiquaries start looking at the maps made by Claudius Ptolemy, or derived from the work of Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, and seeing that he had this place, which he called Morecambe Aescusis, which is translated into Latin as Morecambe Estuarium. But the real meaning of both estuarium and Aescusis is not, as we tend to think of it, the mouth of a river, but it's actually about, Aescusis means a rushing in. It's the sort of tidal thing that's being got over. So the name, actually, that Father West's map of 1774 is the first one that actually uses the word Morecambe Bay. That's the first time that name appears on a map.
And the local use of the sands. the fishermen in Flupra would talk about, they wouldn't talk about going fishing, they'd talk about going to the sands.
Yeah. Yes.
And, the sands was the name of what we now think of as the intertidal area that is the bay.
And it's not, of course, just here. I mean, think again of Brough by Sands, which I mentioned before. The same about Solway. It was the idea of the sands as being an accessible, being somewhere you could go out onto. It's this sort of, hate to be posy and use words like liminal, etc. But it's neither land nor sea. It's that sort of
we have got some more questions, but I can see that David Hodgson has his hand up. David, did you want to ask a question? Do you want to unmute yourself? Yes, please join us.
Right, thank you. It wasn't so much a question as an observation. I actually went on the first ever walk that Cedric did. And you would not believe it. The army, I presume the Territorial Army, turned up in boots and gaiters and were going to march across.
Well, good luck with that. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I am told that, it is possible every now and again to walk across dry shod. But on the 5 occasions I've done it, I've never been anything like dry shod. I mean, on times I've been thigh deep in water. Yeah. Which is why any sensible person would ride on a horse or go in a cart. Yeah.
I know in the early days, Cedric used to do once a year Hest Bank to Canal Foot, but he would only take experienced walkers on that walk.
Yeah, I should have said, of course, that the coaches go from Hest Bank, which is at least a 9-mile trip. Most of the leisure time walks go across from Arnside or just south of Arnside and cut across to Kent Bank, which notionally is only a 3-mile walk, although it's damn sight longer than that when I did it.
That's because of the theatre that Cedric provides. He does this great zigzagging to create some extra theatre for you.
Yeah.
But that's really, really interesting. And there is, of course, one more route that you didn't touch on at all, Bill, which is the crossing at Sunderland Point of the Loon, which is very rarely done.
Yes.
But the community at Sunderland Point have told me that they try every year.
Yes.
When the weather is suitable, when the tides are suitable, probably around this time, around midsummer, they'll be looking out for a suitable time. And as a community, they like to do that crossing just to keep the tradition alive.
Yeah.
But it's never normally publicised, and it's not become an event as such.
Yeah. No, I mean all the major estuaries, for want of a better word, of the Northwest had oversands crossings, or fords of one sort or another. You could ford the Mersey around about Halton. You could certainly ford the Ribble, and this was a frequently used ford until the 18th century between Freckleton and Hesketh. Wow. And I've got a very interesting account of the Civil War, of one of these things where we'll head them off at the pass, where one army's heading one way and the other lot go cut across the sands and escape from them that way. But what I find particularly interesting about this, the Hesketh to Freckleton route, is that there's an excavation been going on at a new Roman fort at Burscough in southwest Lancashire, and it really does look as if there was a Roman road linking Burscough with Kirkham, which involved crossing the sands of the Ribble.
That's terrific. That's terrific. We've got some more questions in the chat, but I can also see that Stevie Cove has got his hand up. I don't know if you'd like to ask your question, if you'd like to come off mute.
I've crossed several times, and just advice, if you're going to cross, is don't end up being a steward at the back, because the last 50 have not got a pair of knees or a pair of hips or anything between them, and helping them up and down the final channels is going to make you miss the train. So that's just a piece of information.
I can only endorse that. 10 years ago, I had no problem. These days, I would be in that group. Yeah.
I was glad we were doing it with the rescue team and we had radios. I was able to call people back from who'd finished the war to help get all these old, terribly old people, up and down. Some of them a great deal younger than me, I might add.
Yes, I know it only too well. Yeah.
Well, our health is our wealth, and any of us who are still fit and healthy should be celebrating that. And those of us that are less so, we hope that you're going to enjoy the Sunset series and other things besides still. Michelle will recall that we had a session with the Bay Search and Rescue people, it must be 4 or 5 years ago now. And we were really seeking advice and guidance around how to run some survey work, archaeological training and such like. And their very firm guidance was wear Wellington boots, because if you get your boot stuck, you can pull your foot out. Whereas if you're wearing a laced boot, you are stuck.
Yes.
Not that we recommend people to perhaps willy-nilly start doing archaeological survey work, but if you must, then wear some footwear that you can easily remove. Now then, Bill, can you see the chat as well? There are some more questions here. There's one from Richard. Can you see that, asking about was there ever a sailing ferry to get across which would be faster than walking?
The only ferry that I have ever come across a reference to is the steamer from Fleetwood to Bardsey, and I haven't been able to find out either when it started or when it finished. I do know that there was a pier at Bardsey where it docked, and I keep meaning to do a little bit more research into that. As far as whether there was ever a sailing boat, the only reference I've found is that one from 1539. Where it's a sort of survey of the possessions of the Duchy of Lancaster. It's called the Book of Improvements, where there is a recommendation that a ferry boat is put on the what they call Cartmel Sands, but I don't know that it ever happened. But again, it'd be interesting if anybody stumbles across a reference to sailing across the bay.
Do you know what time what time period the steamer was active?
Prior to the railway, so we're probably talking the first half of the 19th century,
and then ceased to be used.
The railway seems to have knocked it on its head. Yeah.
Because I remember coming.
I mean, to be honest, I'm just trying to remember. You had to get to Fleetwood, and I think. I'm not sure that Edwin Waugh doesn't talk about it, sort of going, because you had to really go by train to Fleetwood, then get the ferry, the steamer across to Bardsey. That was the sort of way, a new way into the lake. So that would be no earlier than the 1840s, would it? So it possibly only ran for 20 years or so. Yeah.
I remember coming across a photograph of a party of gentlemen who were at Barrow Golf Club, and they were going on their annual outing, and it was said that they were going to Fleetwood by boat, and I'd assumed they'd gone from Barrow, but perhaps they had indeed gone from Bardsey. There is,
Now I'm getting a message from Peter saying the use of Peel Pier was probably the reason. I've lost it for the discontinuation of Bardsey as the furnace terminus. Yes. Okay. Well, again, I don't know if anybody has got any evidence. That would be great.
Send it to us, and we can forward it to Bill. And then, of course, Frank and Margaret are saying that there was the pier at Grange to accommodate sailing vessels. And as far as I recall, that was more or less pleasure boats. It wasn't a means of regular. It wouldn't have had a timetable in the same way that we would think. Yeah.
Well, I think a new Morecambe Bay project should be to resurrect the steamer from Fleetwood to Bardsey, as sort of complementing the bay cycleway. So you cycle all the way around and then you get the steamer back.
There are so many things that we would love to do. I'm just flicking through to see if there are any further questions or people who've got their hand up. So I'm just flicking through my screen. And I think
I've got David Hodgson with his hand up.
Yeah, David, did you want to come back, or had you not lowered your hand?
No, I lowered my hand and I put it up again.
Okay, go on.
Well, as far as I'm aware, the pier at Grange was built by the railway because the boats could no longer get up to Millom. So it was built so that the goods could be left there and carted to Millom. And again, something else. A few years ago, we went and looked at the stone jetty at Earbank. Strangely, there are records from the carter who worked that pier. Yeah. But they're all in the Cumbria Records Office because he lived at Millom. So again, that's somewhere else that people may wish to research. And as far as Fleetwood is concerned, Fleetwood, the boat started sailing from Fleetwood because the line from Preston Fleetwood was built before it went further north.
Yes, it was. Yeah, yeah.
And so there was a regular service also to Ardrossan.
Oh, yes.
You could catch the train to Glasgow at Ardrossan.
Right.
So whether that was all part of the same thing, the one to the Furness Peninsula.
Right. And that would be in the late 1840s into the 1850s.
That sort of period. Yeah.
Yes.
So I say whether it was possibly the boat to Ardrossan was calling there, or whether it was a separate service.
No, that's a research project for someone. Yeah.
Right. I'll let other people have a chance.
Thank you, David.
So I think that Claire has just launched a poll, just a few short questions that help us with our sort of monitoring and help give us some feedback on this. So if you wanted to take a few moments for that, would really appreciate that. Bill, whilst people are busy with that, you might like to scroll back through the chat, and there is a couple of points. There's one from Mandy asking, I don't know if you can see that, if you go further back, asking about salt as a form of cash, which in fact Fiona goes on to answer very succinctly that salt was used as a payment.
Yes.
Hence the word salary.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
My wife just added the word "oh God" when the word salt was mentioned, because I'm beginning to bore everybody on this subject, but it is something I've recently got interested in, the whole idea of salt making, not just around the bay, but right the way down from the Solway to South Lancashire.
Well, that's a subject for a lot of research, and we have done some talks in the past about salt.
I was going to say there are, if you go onto the Morecambe Bay Partnership website and look at some of the past work, you'll find some very good papers about salt making around the bay. You'll find reference to a number of places where the place name Saltcoats still appears. Where about payments made by salt. Sorry.
It's all right, Bill. It's all right. The question was particularly about payments, but the importance of salt in sort of pre-industrial times is not to be underestimated.
Absolutely. Without salt, you haven't got bacon, you haven't got ham, you haven't got salt beef, you haven't got cheese, you haven't got butter, you haven't got bread. It's absolutely essential to an agricultural way of life. And around the bay, there's no doubt whatsoever that the monasteries, Conishead, Cockersands, the one that we mentioned, that we haven't mentioned, we're operating, sultans, we're operating these salt making facilities using this fascinating method called sleeching, which is a subject for another day.
Yeah,
But yes, I mean, Mandy's question about the abbeys having control, not control, but they certainly, it was certainly part of their armoury, their income.
Yeah. And then a couple of contributions from Roger, one saying that there's a place called New Passage related to the ferry across the Severn.
Oh, right, yes.
And also Barrow River in County Waterford.
Yes, okay. So it may be that it is a general term for, well, I mean, those are both related to ferries, aren't they? Yeah. No.
And then Roger lower down in the chat tells us of a recollection of there being a ferry boat called the Wyvern, which plied trade across the bay. He thinks from Fleetwood to Barrow. So we're going to have to find out more about this. Every question we have more questions that follow it.
Yes, good.
Wyvern was a railway tug that was also used for trips across the bay.
Oh, right, was it?
Yes.
So it was owned by the railway company?
Yes, it was a railway tug.
Right. Excellent, thank you.
So those of you who wish to, we're very happy to stay and to chat a little bit more. Those of you who've got a big pile of ironing or some other important duties, calling them away. Thank you all very much, and we very often thank Bill either by showing him that we are clapping or by using the clapping symbol from the chat. So once again, Bill, thank you very, very much for your talk.